The order of expulsion had already been read into the record by the time Senna Voreth found her seat at the clerk's table. She was not supposed to have a reaction. Clerks of the Conclave Tribunal did not react. They logged, they timestamped, they initialed in triplicate. The bench ran 37 meters across the curved dais, and every seat on it was filled, 11 arbiters in slate-gray ceremonial robes, the presiding voice at the center, and around the perimeter of the chamber, 400 observers from 32 member species who had come to watch humanity be formally censured. The dome above was a vault of pale amber glass, and through it the pale light of Vesari's distant sun poured down without warmth. Senna opened her log tablet and set her stylus against the intake line. The human delegation sat at the respondent table below the dais, 3 of them. The lead delegate, a woman named Maret Osin, sat perfectly still, her hands flat on the table's surface. She wore the dark blue of the Terran diplomatic corps, no insignia, no medals, no flags pinned to the lapel. Her 2 aides sat flanking her, equally still, equally quiet. None of them had said a word since the session was called to order. Senna had clerked enough sessions to know what the chamber expected. The respondent was supposed to carry the posture of someone underweight, a slight forward lean, a restlessness of the hands, the small physical signs of an entity that understood the machinery arrayed against it. Osin carried none of that. She sat as though the bench and its 11 arbiters were a feature of the room, like the curved walls or the amber dome overhead, and she was waiting for the session to finish what it had come to do. Presiding arbiter, Cuven Thrall leaned toward his speaking aperture and let the modulation rings in his throat project his voice to every corner of the chamber. The respondent is advised that the tribunal has found, by unanimous preliminary vote, that the Terran delegates' conduct during the Drethanu Accord negotiations constitutes a material breach of the Conclave's instrument of good faith. The tribunal is prepared to enter a formal censure into the permanent record. However, and here Thrall paused, his triple-lidded eyes moving to Maret Osin, the tribunal is equally prepared to receive, in lieu of censure, a formal statement of acknowledgement and contrition delivered by the delegate in this chamber before the assembled membership. The chamber was quiet. This was the offer. This was the mechanism. Senna had seen it before. A censure was a stain on a delegation's credentials, potentially fatal to future representation rights across 11 member systems. A statement of contrition cost nothing but dignity, and most delegations understood the arithmetic. They stood, they read their prepared language, they sat, and the session ended with the tribunal's authority intact. Maret Osin did not move. Thrall's second pair of eyelids slid shut and open, a sign of impatience in his species. The tribunal will allow the respondent 30 standard intervals to consult with her aides before providing an answer. One of the aides, the younger one, a dark-skinned man with the kind of stillness that came from training rather than temperament, leaned perhaps 2 centimeters toward Osin. She did not turn her head. She said something inaudible. He returned to his original posture. The elder aide, a gray-haired woman with a long corps record, looked at the ceiling. The 30 intervals elapsed. Thrall looked at Osin. Osin looked back at him. The respondent is asked to indicate her intention, Thrall said. Senna's stylus hovered over the tablet. She noted the time, 14:32:07 Vesari Standard. Osin reached into the leather document wallet on the table in front of her and withdrew a single folded sheet of pressed material, the old-fashioned kind, fibrous, cream-colored, used for formal legal instruments that predated data storage by centuries. She unfolded it with both hands, placed it flat on the table, smoothed it once with her open palm. Then she left her hands on either side of it, and she waited. The chamber did not know what to do with that. Arbiter Nelsha, third from the left, from the Vorakin Directorate, who had spoken most sharply during the preliminary review, leaned toward the presiding voice. The respondent has produced a document. Is this a formal response? "The tribunal will receive it," Thrall said, and gestured to the document courier, a young Vorakin who sat at the side table between the dais and the respondent's position. The courier crossed the chamber floor in 12 steps. He lifted the sheet with both hands, as was protocol. He carried it back to the dais. He placed it before Thrall. Thrall read it. The chamber watched Thrall's face. Senna watched the chamber watching Thrall's face. Whatever Thrall read, it produced no expression she could catalog, only a kind of stillness that did not match his species' usual range of responses. He set the document down and touched its corner with one fingertip, as though to verify it was material and not a projection. He passed it to Arbiter Nelsha on his left. Nelsha read it, her mandibles compressed together. She passed it to the next arbiter without comment. The document moved down the bench. Senna logged each handoff at the time it occurred, her stylus moving by habit while her attention tracked the faces above. The chamber was absolutely silent. None of the 400 observers were doing what observers normally did: the shuffling, the whispered commentary, the past notations. They were still. The document reached the last arbiter at the right end of the bench. He read it. He set it face down. Thrall spoke. "The tribunal requires a brief recess." It was the first unscheduled recess in the session's 17-year history. The recess lasted 40 minutes. Senna sat at her table and did not move, because clerks did not move during recesses unless directed. The human delegation did not move either. Osin's hands remained on either side of where the document had been. She did not look up at it. The observer galleries were not so composed. Senna could hear the undertow, low, rapid exchanges in 3 or 4 languages she recognized, and several she did not. The scratch of styluses against notation pads, the shift of bodies in tiered seating. The Drethanu observers had formed a tight cluster near the upper railing, elongated heads pressed close. The Vorakin block was divided, 3 delegates standing, 4 seated, none looking at the human table. What they were looking at was the instrument of good faith itself, projected on the chamber's reference screen at the far wall, its text scrolling in 8 languages, while someone in the gallery ran a search she could not read from this distance. She knew what they were searching for. Everyone in the room with legal standing was searching for the same thing. Clause 14, subsection 9. Senna did not search. She knew what it said. She had indexed the instrument during her first year of clerking, and the withdrawal provisions had struck her as an artifact, a procedural formality included because procedures required completion, never intended for use. The conclave's instrument was the framework within which disputes were resolved, not exited. The idea that a signatory might invoke the withdrawal clause was the kind of possibility the instrument acknowledged in 1 paragraph and buried under 14 appendices. 1 paragraph, 60 cycles advance notice filed with the senior clerk of record. Senna noted in the margin of her log an informal notation, never part of the official record, something she had never done in 9 years of clerking, a single word: waiting. When the arbiters returned, they did not take their seats in the usual order. Thrall went directly to the speaking aperture. "The tribunal has reviewed the document produced by the Terran delegate. The document is—" He stopped. His second pair of eyelids cycled twice, a formal notice of withdrawal. The chamber produced a sound Senna had no word for. Not a gasp, not an outcry. Something lower and less organized, like the sound of a structure settling after the earth beneath it shifts. The Terran delegation formally withdraws from the conclave's instrument of good faith, effective upon delivery of this notice, as provided under Clause 14, subsection 9 of the instrument itself. The delegation further advises the tribunal that, pursuant to the same clause, any censure entered while a signatory is in the process of formal withdrawal is without effect and carries no weight under the instrument's jurisdiction. Nelsha spoke without being recognized. "The clause requires 60 cycles advance notice. The tribunal has not received. The document is dated, Thrall said. He did not look at Nelsha. 60 cycles ago. The silence that followed was a different kind than the one before. The first silence had been the silence of watching. This was the silence of calculation. 400 observers from 32 species running numbers they did not like. Senna ran them too. 60 cycles. The Terran delegation had filed the withdrawal before the preliminary vote, before the session was scheduled, before Thrall had called the chamber to order and read the expulsion into the record that Senna was supposed to be logging without reaction. The censure the tribunal had announced, the mechanism that was supposed to bring Maret Osin to her feet with a prepared statement of contrition, had no weight, had never had any weight. The tribunal had voted unanimously against a jurisdiction they no longer held. Arbiter D. Henk, second from the right, said, "The terms of withdrawal require the signatory to notify the senior clerk of record at time of filing." Every head in the chamber turned to Senna. She looked at her tablet. She opened the intake archive, the back-channel filing system, the queue that clerks were supposed to check each morning and which, in practice, accumulated for days between reviews. She had not checked it this morning. She had come in, found her seat, set her stylus to the intake line, and begun the session's log. The filing was there, time-stamped 61 cycles ago, 1 cycle early. It had sat in the intake queue, properly filed, completely valid, while the tribunal built its case and rehearsed its offer of contrition. The silence deepened. Arbiter Nelsha had gone very still. The mandibles that had compressed during the first reading of the document were now flat, not tension, but the absence of expression entirely. She said quietly to Thrall, "If the clerk of record received the filing at cycle 61, then at the moment the preliminary vote was cast." "The withdrawal was already in effect," Thrall said. He said it the way someone states a fact they have already verified 3 times and cannot make false by verifying a 4th. From the observer galleries, a delegate from the Meridian Assembly, Senna recognized his crest. The tightly braided silver tendrils of his diplomatic rank stood without requesting recognition. Presiding arbiter. If the Terran delegation was no longer a signatory at the time of the preliminary vote, the tribunal had no jurisdictional standing to call this session. The instrument defines tribunal authority solely over active signatories. Thrall looked at him for a long moment. "That is correct," Thrall said. The Meridian delegate sat down slowly. What followed was not the noise of a chamber dissolving into outcry. It was worse. It was the sound of the arithmetic completing itself in 32 minds simultaneously, the realization arriving in staggered waves as each delegation worked through what had just been confirmed. The tribunal had not merely failed to censure humanity. It had convened an illegitimate session, read an invalid expulsion order into the permanent record, and done so while the subject of that session sat calmly at the respondent table and said nothing, because there had been nothing she needed to say. Senna looked up from her tablet. She found Maret Osin's eyes across the chamber floor, and she could not have said why. It was not protocol, it was not her place, but she held them for a moment. Osin's expression was not satisfaction. It was not triumph. It was the face of someone who had known, for 60 cycles, exactly what this room would do, and who had found it necessary to let the room do it anyway. So the record would be complete. So it would be the tribunal's own voice in the tribunal's own archive. Then Osin stood. Her 2 aides stood with her in the same instant without a signal Senna could detect. "We'll see ourselves out," Osin said. 3 words, no inflection, no anger, no contempt, no performance, only the flatness of a statement so precisely fitted to its moment that adding a syllable would have diminished it. They walked toward the chamber exit. The great doors were 20 meters away. No one stopped them. No one spoke. Arbiter Thrall stood at the bench with the document in both hands and watched them cross the floor of his chamber, and the silence held until the doors closed. Senna logged the departure time, 16:04:43 Vesari Standard. She logged the session status, concluded no formal resolution reached. She logged the document, received, distributed, filed in the permanent record. Then she closed her stylus and sat very still, thinking about 9 years of sessions, about the mechanisms of the instrument she had watched applied without question, about contrition she had watched extracted from 23 delegations across her tenure, and about the particular quality of a withdrawal clause written into the instrument they had all signed, that anyone could have read at any time, that one delegation had read with care, and one clerk had not checked her cue. The chamber was producing noise again, voices finding each other across the tiers, the scrape of chairs, the low, urgent sound of damage assessment beginning in 32 languages simultaneously. Thrall was conferring with the senior arbiter in rapid, quiet tones. Nelsha had a copy of the instrument in her hands and was working down Clause 14 with the focused expression of someone who already knew what she would find. Senna closed her log tablet. The session was over. The clerk had nothing more to record. She thought, without writing it. The tribunal had offered Maret Osin a choice between dignity and standing, and Osin had declined the premise entirely. She had filed the paperwork 60 cycles ago, taken her seat while the machinery ran its course, and let it reach its conclusion, not because she was required to endure it, but because she had already made it irrelevant, and there was something in the completeness of that she had wanted the record to hold in full. Every step the tribunal took against a jurisdiction it no longer possessed was now in the archive, permanent, unalterable, the tribunal's own work. The instrument was the architecture of everything: trade rights, military coordination, the jurisdictional codes governing 17 inhabited systems. With humanity outside it, every downstream agreement was open to renegotiation. The member delegations would spend months calculating what that meant. The conclave's legal division would spend longer. Senna did not know what would come next. That was not her job. Her job was the record. She filed it, closed her case, and walked out of the chamber, not because she meant to follow anyone, but because she was done and the door was ahead of her. And sometimes that is the only reason a person needs.